Okay, today's lesson is going to be on the bandsaw. Now, first of all, we call this a bandsaw because the saw is made as a band. If we open it up and take a look inside, you can see that the blade goes down through here. This is where it cuts, goes around a wheel on the bottom, up through this little channel and back around the wheel on the top. So it's always, the blade is always going down. So it's one continuous band. I think that's why it's called a bandsaw, right? Bandsaws are sized by the distance between the blade and the channel, the opening here, this throat depth we call it, which is essentially the diameter of the wheels of the bandsaw. This is a two-wheel bandsaw, which is typical. They do make some small benchtop three-wheel bandsaws that go up and down to a third wheel and down this way, just because they're so small that if they didn't, you wouldn't be able to do much on them. But the size of the bandsaw, this is a 20-inch bandsaw. That means from here to here is 20 inches. That's the furthest you can cut to the left of the blade. Okay, so that's what a bandsaw is called. That's why a bandsaw is called a bandsaw, and that's how they're sized. Now, what do you do with a bandsaw? What's its purpose? It will basically do lots of things. It'll do straight cuts with the grain, called a rip cut. It'll cut across the grain, which is a cross cut, and you can cut curves with it. It's safe to cut rough lumber on it, so there's lots and lots of things you can do. Really, the only thing you can't do on a bandsaw is cut something out of the middle, because there's no way to get the saw blade into the middle. On other saws, you could drill a hole and put the blade through, but because this blade is a continuous band, there's no way to get the blade in there. So it's about the only thing you really can't do on a bandsaw. It's really a great machine. The other downside to a bandsaw is that the cut is not a finished cut. In other words, the surface is on the rough side when you're done. It will cut a perfectly straight line if you're using a fence or a miter gauge, but the cut finish is not a finished cut. So I would not come here typically to make my finished cuts to size, but it's great for cutting boards to rough size, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, I'm following along again on a handout that you can get online, and it shows you all the information that you need to know. And again, we talked about the size of the bandsaw being determined by the throat depth, and that fact that we can cut across the grain this way, we can cut with the grain this way, rip cut, and we can cut any kind of a curve that we want. So those are the kinds of things that it can do. And again, it mentions here on the handout that it doesn't make good, smooth, finished cuts, but it's great for cutting rough boards. Now, the reason it's good for rough boards, let's just talk about that for just a second, is a rough board like this may not sit very steady. So as you're cutting, the board could wiggle a little bit, but the blade is designed to cut a curve, and it's flexible. It has to be flexible to go around the wheels, so it can really handle a little bit of movement like that while it's cutting. I would not cut rough lumber like this on a table saw because a little movement like this could cause a dangerous kickback on a table saw. So this is a very safe place to cut this. Plus, the bandsaw blade is pushing straight down into the table. Again, unlike the table saw, which turns towards you and down, if something happened, it's going to throw the board backwards. Here, it's always pushing straight down, so it's not going to do anything other than push the board that way. The very worst thing that can happen on a bandsaw is the blade break. And usually when the blade breaks, it just stops. It gets tangled up and you have to put on a new one. It costs you money. But safety-wise, there's not a whole lot that you have to be concerned about. We'll talk about a little bit more about blade breaking in a little bit. Let's talk about safety, though. Like any machine, you got to be careful when you're operating a bandsaw. You know, you stick your finger into that blade, it's going to cut your finger off. Simple, right? If you look in the meat department at the supermarket, what's sitting in the middle of the meat department? A big old stainless steel bandsaw cuts through meat and bone all day long. So we don't want that cutting through your fingers. So some of the basic safety rules, the first basic one that we have is complete attention should be directed toward the work being done, no talking. It's probably the most important because this machine is so easy to use, you will get comfortable with it quickly. And once you start to get too comfortable, that's when you run the risk of getting hurt. And the only way you're really going to get hurt is to run your finger into the blade. But that can happen easily by, you're not paying attention and making a cut, and your thumb is sticking out a little bit more than you think it is, and you cut the end of your thumb off. Or you're just being careless, right? This machine, as soon as you get lax at a machine, you're opening yourself up for injury. When you're nervous and you're tuned in and you're paying attention and your heart's beating a little faster, you're less likely to get injured if you know what you're doing because you're focused, right? Here, if you use this machine a lot, after a while, it's just the bandsaw. You come here with that kind of attitude, you're going to get hurt. So complete attention. When you're over here at the workbench working and you're talking to your buddies about last night's football game or something, when you come over here, you need to be tuned into what you're doing. Leave that conversation at the bench and be focused for those few seconds that you're running the machine. And when you're done, when you come back over here, the machine stopped, now you can kind of refocus on your conversation again. But please pay attention to what you're doing when you're at the bandsaw. That's the main reason people get hurt at a bandsaw, is just lack of focus. All right? And that's, again, the very first safety rule we have on our sheet here. Pay attention, no talking. And again, the standard safety rules we have: remove loose jewelry, roll up your sleeves, restrain long hair, ask permission each time you use a machine. That goes for any machine. Always tell the teacher you're going to be using a machine before you turn it on. And if you're not thoroughly familiar with the operation of the machine, speak to the teacher before using it, not one of your buddies. Ask the teacher for assistance. They're the ones that are trained to teach you. And that's me. Okay? These are safety rules that we have for all the machines. Those 5 first safety rules. There are a few that are particular to the bandsaw. The first one is you want to adjust the guide wheels so they're about 1/4 of an inch above the work. Now these are the guide wheels here. There's a set here and there's actually another set just underneath the table. And the higher this is, the more risk you have of getting your hands in there, obviously. So we want to get this down so it's about 1/4 of an inch above the work. That's a test question, by the way, those of you that are going to take the safety test. You want to have those guide wheels about 1/4 of an inch above. That obviously covers more of the blade, but it also holds the blade steady because remember, the blade's flexible. And the further away it is from the wood, the more it's going to dance around. Now, if you come around the back here, there is a knob that adjusts that, and that's this knob back here. Hang on to this when you loosen this, because this is a little bit on the heavy side. You don't want to grab the front cover because it kind of slides. You want to grab the steel part in the back. Loosen this up. Bring this down. So you've got about 1/4 of an inch. I always say it's about the thickness of a pencil underneath here. And I put the board behind it because that's the lowest point in that mechanism, is the back side. So I put the piece of wood underneath, get it about 1/4 of an inch above, tighten that back up, and we're back in business. All right? Obviously, having it adjusted at that height is a lot safer than having it adjusted way up here. That's going to cut just the same, but obviously you can cut your arm off in that situation. So you want to have it down, again, 1/4 of an inch above, right about there. So that's a good safe height for cutting a piece of wood this thickness. So that's the first specific safety rule. The other is to position your hands so they're not in front of the blade. Again, this is just a good habit to get into, right? If I'm cutting and I have my hand here, my thumb, again, is in the line of the blade, right? So I might think, I'll move it when I get a little closer. Bad idea. Be in the habit of holding your hands way further away than you really need to. My philosophy is if you have to be this safe, practice being this safe, so that you get in that habit of exaggerating your safety a little bit. So on the one day when you just daydream for a split second, you're just in a habit of keeping your hands way away from the blade and you're doing safe things. Right? So getting good habits by keeping your hands out of the path of the blade. Remember too that if you're cutting a curve, sometimes you're putting twisting pressure in, so even though your hand's not in front of the blade, you could be in the path of the blade because you got a twisting motion going on there. So keep that in mind. Never get your fingers closer than 2 inches to the blade. Now that's also a safety rule we have for the table saw. So picture a ring around that saw blade about 2 inches away, and you want to keep your hands outside of that space. So keep your hands out here. Yeah, could you get in here and cut through without cutting your fingers off? Probably. But what happens if somebody bumps into you? When you're in the middle of, you're in here doing this and you're not paying attention to what's going on around you, and somebody's at the workbench and they back up for a second and bump into you, they bump into your arm and your hand gets pushed forward, you don't stand a chance. But if your hands are far enough away and somebody bumps into you, you're probably going to be in a safer place and hopefully survive that little incident, right? So no closer than 2 inches. When the machine is running, don't stand on the right side of the machine if the blade should break. And again, this is a real slight chance. This is what I consider the right side of the machine in this area. It's happened in the past 40 years, maybe twice, where the blade breaks, and it happens to break just at the right spot where the end of the blade hits here and the momentum pushes the rest of the blade out behind it and it comes out like spaghetti, but razor sharp spaghetti. So if you're standing over here waiting for your turn on the bandsaw, right, and this coil of bandsaw blade wraps around your face, that's probably not going to be a good thing. So it's probably not a good place to stand. The chances of that happening are pretty low, but they're there. So my suggestion is to wait away from the machine. Like if you're behind here helping somebody, that's a safe place to be. Or if you need something out of the barrel, like a piece of scrap wood, just wheel the barrel over, all right? But I just rather you not stand, right at this spot, just because I've seen it happen just a couple of times over the years. Usually when the blade breaks, it just stops. And it makes a big bang noise that makes you jump, but it usually just stops. But just on the off chance that it does come out of the side of the machine, that's where it would come out, so don't hang out over there. Let's see. The width of the blade has a factor too. When we talk about the width of the blade, that's the distance from the front to the back. This is kind of a medium width blade. The narrower the blade is, the sharper curve you can make. If I had a wider blade on here, I could only make a gradual curve. This kind of makes a medium-sized curve. If I had a really skinny blade, I can make pretty tight curves. So just be conscious of that as you try to make a turn. If you feel the machine starting to labor or, complain a little bit, that means you're making too sharp of a turn. You could cause the blade to break. So be conscious of that. And on the handout, there is a little chart down on the bottom that gives you an idea of blade width and radius. We have the kind of a middle size blade there. This is greatly reduced, by the way, but it gives you an idea of what the width of the blade, how it affects the tightness of the curve you can make. Here's a funny one. This one says, the stock must be firmly held and supported against the downward thrust of the saw. What does that mean? All that means the board has to lay flat, okay? Now, most of the lumber that you're going to be cutting, a board like this, or even a rough board like this, it's going to lay flat on the table, all right? It's a pretty easy thing to cut with. But let's say you had something unique. Let's say you just turned this bowl on the lathe, and you wanted to make decorative cuts on the edge. Well, if I went over to the saw blade and tried to do that cut, the downward pressure of the saw blade is going to want to make this flip over. This is a funny shape, right? There's nothing underneath supporting it. So that would not be a good thing to do. But if I flip this over and made a cut, now it's supported. So that's what that safety rule is talking about. So if you have something that's an odd shape, like this bowl or something like that, just make sure that it's supported and realize that the pressure against it is going to be down on the blade. So you don't want to do something like this where it's going to flip the board over and cause a problem, right? So that's what that safety rule is talking about. Before backing out of a cut, stop the machine to prevent the blade from being pulled off the wheels and breaking. Relief cuts are allowable exception. Okay, so again, as we saw before, the blade is on this wheel. And notice that it's just laying flat on the wheel. It's not in a groove like a pulley or anything. So the only thing that's holding the blade on the right spot of the wheel is the alignment of the machine. When you make a cut with the saw, let's say I'm going to make a cut now and push against the blade to make a cut, there's a ball bearing right here that the back of the blade rides against so that the blade doesn't get pushed off the wheel backwards that way. But if I was to get into a cut and then try to back out and caught the back of the wheel, the back of the blade, there's nothing in front of the blade to hold it there, so it could just drift right off this wheel and come off. Now with the machine off, there's no danger of that because it's not moving, right? But if it was moving, it would pull off because it could track forward and come right off, and it would happen fairly easily. So you have to be conscious of that when you're cutting. Now, let's say I was making a curved cut through here, and I got off my line and I had to back up a little bit. What I could do is hit the stop button. There's a brake on this machine, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I stop the blade. So once the blade's at a dead stop, then I can carefully wiggle it out of there without the risk of it coming off, right? But with it running, you do not want to back up, especially on a curvy cut. Now it talks about relief cuts. Let's just talk about that for a second. Let's say that I wanted to make a cut on this piece of wood that was like that. So, and I want to cut this off. So here's a curvy cut. I can cut this off on the bandsaw. But before I cut the curve, I want to make what's called relief cuts. These are cuts that come in fairly straight and stop about a 1/16 away from the line on when I'm gonna make this kind of a cut. Those relief cuts, I will let you go in and back out as long as you're careful, and you'll make the relief cut straight. I would not make a curved relief cut. I would always come in straight so I can make that cut, carefully back out, make the next one. And the reason it's okay to do it then is because your cuts are straight and reasonably short, and that you're consciously being careful of pulling the blade off. If you had to stop the machine every time you made a relief cut, you'd be here for a long period of time, and it's not good to turn the machine on and off and on and off and on and off 100 times. So relief cuts are the exception that we allow as long as you're careful. You make that relief cut, carefully back out, make another one, carefully back out, and you just watch what you're doing. Don't make curved relief cuts. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll do some. Okay, so the only time you back up with it running is when you're making relief cuts. Every other time, turn it off if you're going to back up with a cut. If the blade should break or anything else goes wrong with the machine, what do you think the right thing to do would be? Turn it off, right? So if the blade breaks, all I want you to do is hit the stop button, step away from the machine, and call me over, right? Don't worry about stepping on the brake or anything else. Just turn the power off to this machine, and you can do that from a safe place, and just come and get me. Don't let anybody near the machine until I come over, okay? That goes for any machine. If something goes wrong, you smell smoke, you see sparks, somebody's making a funny noise, there's a funny rattle, turn it off and call me over, all right? But that's something that would happen on the bandsaw. If you're using it, all of a sudden you hear a bang and the blade stops moving, just back up, turn it off, and call me over. More than likely, I'll hear the bang and come over anyway. Number 9, make all adjustments with the power off and the blade at a dead stop. Again, there's no need to be adjusting the fence or the guide with it moving. In fact, you definitely don't want to be doing that. I would not want my fingers in here with that blade moving. Okay, it doesn't take much to cut through your finger. All right, make sure it's completely stopped. Do all your setup, and then you can turn it on. 10, stop the machine before removing scrap pieces from the table. Again, resist that temptation to kind of flick the pieces of wood out of the way, because if you misjudge and you flick your finger into that moving blade, the end of your finger will go across the room, and that would not be good. Hold the material and feed it into the blade at a moderate speed. The bandsaw cuts pretty quickly, but you still could cut too fast. So cut as fast as you can control, and if you hear the machine laboring, obviously you're cutting too fast. So learn how to listen to the machine, and that goes for any machine. You know, learn what the machine sounds like when it's normally operating, and if it starts to slow down or bog down, it means you're cutting too heavily, too quickly. Make relief cuts before making long or sharp curves, and we'll do that in a little bit. Stop the machine and don't walk away until it has come to a complete stop. Use the foot brake. Let's do a little demonstration here on that. So if we turn the machine on, let's see what's going to be behind me. Just this thicker piece of wood here. So here's the machine running. Gotta get up to speed. Always let the machine get up to full speed before you use it, right? And then if I turn it off, it's going to coast for quite a while, all right? So the power is off and it's still spinning, right? And I've even been talking for a few seconds, and now you do an awful lot of cutting off, all right? It's still cutting, all right? Just to make a little further demonstration, some people will step on the brake. There's a brake right down here, and they'll do one of these, right? They get it up running, right? And they'll step on the brake and get it almost stopped, and then they'll walk away, and it's still going, right? And then some poor guy is going to come up here. Let me stop this. He's pretend it's still moving, and he's going to come over here looking in the barrel for something, not realize that's moving, and he's going to drop his hand on here and cut the end of his fingers off because he doesn't realize it's still moving, right? It'll coast for a long time, and I usually do this just to show. It doesn't have to be moving much to cut into the wood. That's a finger, all right? And that's with me just giving it a little spin. So you can see that this blade is pretty aggressive, and a piece of wood is a lot harder than a finger is. A piece of pine like this. So please make sure it's completely stopped before you walk away. Step on this pedal. Don't be afraid to step on it good and hard. And it stops pretty quickly. Obviously, turn the power off before you step on the brake. All right? And then cut rough boards with the cup side down. Here's another good thing to realize, that most boards will have a cup to them. If you take a look at this one, can you see how it wants to wiggle left and right if I have it down this way? So it'll cut this way, and it's not a big deal, but it's a lot better if I could flip it over and cut it with the cup down. It sits a little bit better and less likely to rock. So always put a board on the machine so it's the most stable. That's just another little pointer there. All right, so that's safety on the bandsaw. Again, real easy machine to use. Really the only setup thing you really want to do is get the guide wheels a quarter of an inch above the work. And after that, it'll cut fine as long as you don't stick your fingers in it. But let's talk about the different kinds of cuts. We have cross cuts, rip cuts, and curved cuts. So we'll follow along on the handout. Cross cutting seems to be first, so we'll talk about that first. So So if I want to cut my board to length, I can cut something as long as it doesn't get any longer than my throat depth. Going in this direction, I can really go as long as I can handle, you know, sensibly. The fence does come off. If I wanted to, I could take the fence off, slide it right off, and put it on the floor. And then my board could be fairly long. But after a while, it gets too long to be safe. So you got to use your head when it comes to this kind of a thing. You know, if it sticks out about here someplace, that's okay. But when it starts getting so big that it doesn't want to lay on the table and it's falling, probably shouldn't be cutting it at the bandsaw. Maybe go someplace else. Lots of times, if I don't have any other machine, I might just take a handsaw, cut my board to a rough length, and finish any other cross cuts with it at a sensible size. Okay. Now I could cross cut just by pushing that across here, but there's no way to keep that cut accurate. That could be crooked or curved or something. So if I wanted a reasonably accurate cross cut, I can use a miter gauge. Miter gauge fits in the slot in the table. All right. Goes like this, and you can actually, typically it's set up for 90, but if I loosen this knob here, I could adjust it to other angles as well. And the way it works is you put the edge of the board against it. So if I wanted to cut an angle, I could set it to cut any angle that I want. I usually want it at 90. So the easiest and quickest way to do it is to, if you loosen this handle, you can think it's not at 90, turn it upside down, and put this right up against the front of the machine, snug it up, and that's pretty darn close. And usually at the bandsaw, we're not making super accurate cuts anyway, because it's usually for rough cutting at this point. So that's plenty good. Okay. And then you're going to put the edge of the board, best edge if you have one, against the miter gauge, and holding it against the miter gauge with the other hand, you're going to make the cut. Now you got to be careful here, because you know, again, you could, if you have your hand like this, see how my thumb is positioned where I might be getting cut there if I'm not paying attention, right? And the other thing is when the miter gauge goes past the blade, look how close by it comes. You don't want any body parts sticking out past the miter gauge, all right? So what I do is I hold the miter gauge on our saw, because the slot is to the right of the blade. I'll hold the miter gauge to my left hand, so most of me is to the right, and I have this hand here, and I just kind of tuck my thumb in so it's in out of the way. Again, exaggerate your safety. Make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and it's safe. All right. If you get sloppy and you're doing one of these, or you know you have your hand like this, you know you're asking for trouble. So don't do that. Keep yourself contained when you do this. And then when you cross cut, you need to have a line. So let's say that I wanted to cut it off right here, and if I have a particular size in mind, I can line up my blade with it off, back it up, hit the start button, and then right through. Now, I don't like to pull the miter gauge back with the board in place, so I'll just pull the miter gauge back by itself. That piece of wood over there, I can push out of the way with a, you know, my board or a push stick or something, but I'm not going to reach in there to grab that. And again, step on the brake, you can make it stop nice and quick, and then you can get rid of your scrap. So that gives you a nice 90-degree straight cut, okay? But again, the surface is a little bit on the rough side, so I would want to do my finish cuts at a machine that leaves me a nicer surface. But I can cut a reasonably accurate cross cut using a miter gauge. So cross cutting, I use a miter gauge. Now what about when I want to cut with the grain, called a rip cut? Well, that's the next one. By the way, when I do cross cutting, notice no miter gauge. Now I don't have to take it off like I have it off, but as long as it's out of the way, I'm good. Okay, I just happen to have it off at this time. So for ripping, I'm going to need the fence. Let me throw it back on here. And if it is off, you just got to slide it back on the bars here. Make sure it's straight, it doesn't get caught. And you got a few controls on the fence. Let's talk about that first. This big knob in the front locks it in place. Okay, you don't have to lean on this thing to get it to lock. Just a little bit of pressure makes it pretty secure. Don't force it down and bend the handle or anything. People do that too often. This knob here actually locks the other end. Now with this locked, this is solid, but there is a little bit of play out here, very, very little. I rarely lock the back, because most of the time when I'm cutting here, anyway, I'm making a rough cut. So I've got some extra wood on there anyway, and I'm not super worried about super-de-duper perfectly straight. But if you wanted it for some reason, you tighten this, and what it does at the other end is a finger that grabs the other bar on the other side, and now it's really solid, okay? If you unlock this and go to move it and it won't move, it's because somebody locked that. So just loosen that a turn or so, and now it will move, all right? So that knob loosens that far end. Now this other knob that's on here, is spring-loaded, and what it does, it's got a little gear on the bottom. That underneath here is some gear teeth. So what I usually do is I get this close to where I want it, and I push this in, and then I can turn it, and that gives me like fine-tuning to get it where I want it. Now, our fence is not accurate because we've added this piece of wood on the fence for various reasons, but it throws the scale off. So this scale is not accurate. So we have a ruler hanging here. So let's say I wanted to cut my boards to, let's say 6 inches wide, all right? So I can put the ruler with the zero end against the fence and get this close to 6 inches, and then push our fine-tuning knob in and roll it around until I get to 6 inches. And again, what I'm measuring is the distance from the fence to the inside of the blade. In other words, the space between them. Not really looking at the middle of the blade. If you look straight on at that, you'll see that that 6 inches is really to the inside of the blade, if I did it right. And then bandsaw blade's not real thick like a table saw blade, but still there is a thickness there. And again, typically I'm making a rough cut here, so you don't have to get crazy about this. But if you are doing some kind of an important, accurate cut, you do want to measure between the two. The piece you want needs to be between the blade and the fence. The piece beyond the blade is your scrap. So this is the piece I want. Whatever's left over out here is scrap. Okay? And that way, this cut becomes parallel to whatever edge you put against the fence. All right? So what I would do is I'd set my fence up using the ruler. I can use a tape measure as well. Okay? Same thing. Right? I can measure it the same way. And the easiest way to do it is put the zero end of whatever you're using to measure against the fence and measure out. It's a lot easier than trying to do this way. Okay? When I put the board against here, I'm going to put my best edge against the fence. Now, I already have the blade height at the right spot. So let's say I've got a little bit of knot here that I'd like to cut off if I can. So this is my better edge. I'm going to put my better edge here so that this will become the scrap that gets thrown away. So when you go to come over here, make sure you're paying attention on what the good edge on your board is. Okay? Now, when you do this, you might want to have a push stick or two. I've got a couple of push sticks. I'll keep them handy. And the rule is, you don't want your fingers coming any closer than 2 inches. Well, I've got 6 here, so I could theoretically run this through here with my hand. Sometimes I'll do that, but I can use a push stick also. And maybe for the beginning, since the board is so long, if I try to put the push stick here, it's kind of clumsy. So I'm going to put the push stick here and grab it for the very end. This hand, by the way, as I make this cut, is going to get a little close to the blade. So this one's going to be using a push stick to hold it tight to the fence. So the purpose of this hand is to keep it to the fence, and I'll push it through when I want to get close. I'm going to go to here. So this is what it looks like. Using this tight, and I'm starting off with just my hand. Holding this tight. Now, if I'm not doing a good job here, watch what happens over here. See how the board is just ripped away from the fence? That you end up with a crooked cut. So that's why you want to keep this here. And I could always reach around and hold it out here too. Right? Once I'm over the table, I can stop, grab the other push stick, and finish the cut. All right? And then I can hit the stop button, turn it off, and get my knife out. Okay? You can see what happens when the board drifts away from the fence there. See how it kind of cut a narrow spot? So that's why it's important to make sure it stays tight to the fence. Right? So that's how you do a rip cut. Easy enough. Let's see, any other rip cut considerations here? I think that's got it. If you got a really long board, you might want to have a helper on the other side so that when the board gets off the table, because the table on a bandsaw is not very big, to help support it. And that might be the only other concern that you might want to have with a rip cut. All right? But pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. We commonly come to the bandsaw for those initial rough cuts. When you're going to make a project, the first step, excuse me, is to take your parts list and cut your pieces to rough size, 1/2 inch wider and 1 inch longer. If they're small enough, you could do both of those here. You may have to cut the length with a handsaw or a radial arm saw if you have one. But the rough width you're going to cut here for sure. Right? So after you get the rough length cut, definitely want to come here for the rough width. You don't really need a line on the board. Okay, we needed a line for cross cutting because we needed to know where to make the cut. But with the rip cut, if I had the fence set in the right spot, I don't really need a line. And sometimes people will draw a line, but to me it's kind of a waste of time. So just set the fence up with the ruler where you need it, and away you go. Okay? If you want me to double check your fence setting, let's get it all set up. Hey, Mr. Chick, come over. Is this the right spot? I was supposed to be 6 5/8. Is this 6 5/8? I'll measure it for you. Yeah, we're good. And then away you go. All right? So that's cross-cutting. So we did, ripping. We did cross-cutting and ripping. Let's just take a look at the handout, make sure we didn't miss any fine points here. I don't know if I mentioned before, but when you cross-cut, we cross-cut on the scrap side of the line. So if I cut my board to length, I should have mentioned this before when I had a miter gauge out. But let's say I trimmed one end and now I want to cut the other end. And I have a little pencil line that I want to cut to, right? Wherever my pencil line is, I want to cut on the scrap side of the line. This is one of these things that applies to the bandsaw, applies to the table saw, to the chop saw. You never want to cut on the side of the line that your good wood is on. If your scrap is out here, you want the blade passing on the scrap side of the line so you don't end up cutting it too short. That was just another little point about cross-cutting. And then ripping, we measured between the blade and the fence. Do not use a miter gauge and the fence together. There's no reason on the bandsaw to use these two together. Cross-cutting, we're using this. Ripping, we're using this. We never use the two together. Okay, important concept. Now, if I want to cut a curve, I'm not going to use either one. No fence or miter gauge, I'm just going to cut a curve. Let's cut the curve that we laid out before on our regular piece of wood. Let's lower the guard just a little bit. A 1/4 of an inch. All right, so my first step is to make relief cuts. Now, you don't have to draw lines for the relief cuts, although you do need the line that you're going to cut out on. But now I'm going to make these relief cuts. The sharper the curve, the more relief cuts I'm going to want to make. So, maybe I'll make one here. Make them short and straight. Carefully back out. And notice that I'm not cutting all the way to the line. I'm stopping before I get to the line. If I do this, I'll do one wrong on purpose here. If I cut to the line and then back out, later on when I want to cut that to size, I'm going to have a problem. All right? If the curve is gentle, maybe I can space those relief cuts further apart. Just be careful as you back out. So that's probably what I would do for relief cuts, to cut this out. And once you have the relief cuts made, come in and cut next to the line. Do not cut on the line. Every time you get to a relief cut now, that piece falls off. Okay? Don't go reaching in to get that piece, by the way. Right? And you just continue around. The pieces will fall off as you go along. If they start to get in the way, you could just turn it off. Move away and push it out with your board, or turn it off and go get them. Every once in a while, if you cut a really little piece, it'll fall into that little space behind the blade down in here, and it'll get stuck. In that case, you're going to have to turn it off, stop the blade, and get that out of there. All right? So now I'm just going to continue along. If I decide that I want to cut on the line, thinking that I'm really good and I'm going to just cut right on the line, you can see I'm starting to get close to the maximum of the curve here. All right? What's going to happen is I'm going to have a problem. Now, let's finish this up here. So there's my curve cut. And it's just a steering thing. But you can see here where I cut on the line, I'm already too small. So now how am I going to get rid of all of this roughness? I can't sand it out. I'm going to make it even smaller yet. Here's my relief cut that I went too far on. Now I got this groove I got to deal with, right? And even when I sand down to the line, because that's how you deal with this. You cut out a curve a little bigger than you need, and then you go to the sander to bring it down to size. But that cut's still going to be there because it's beyond my line. So stop your relief cuts before you get to the line. If you're cutting on a curve, let's say you want to cut a curve out. Here, I'll do this one without any relief cuts. Let me get all these pieces of wood out of the way. And then, let's say I get into the curve, right? And I start getting too close. And I go, uh-oh, I'm getting too close. You don't want to back up. So all you got to do is you stop, hit the stop button, stop the blade, and now I can wiggle out of there, and then there's no chance of me pulling the blade off, all right? And then I can start it up and then fix my cut. Okay, but don't try to back up, especially in a curve with it running. Now, here's one thing that I can show you, and I don't really like you doing this, but I let go of the board. I normally would never do that on a machine, but just to illustrate the fact that this machine's pushing straight down, it's not going to kick the board out at me, right? It's pretty safe, right? It's not going anywhere. So this machine, because of the way it works, is really pretty safe, but what happens is people get too lax and it makes it dangerous because they're not tuned in when they're at the machine. Every time you come here, think about the fact that you can cut your fingers off. When I was in junior high, my shop teacher painted a hand right here with 2 fingers missing and blood dripping down. So that when you came up to the bandsaw, you went, hey, right? And it made you kind of think for a second about what this could do. So I didn't want to get that graphic, although I think it's a pretty good idea. You need to be tuned in about the fact that this thing can cut your fingers off really, really easily. It's not going to pull you in. It's not going to do anything unexpected. It's only going to happen if you're not paying attention. So stay focused and you won't have any problems. So that covers the kinds of things we can do on the bandsaw. Cross-cutting with a miter gauge, ripping with a fence, or cutting curves, which you would do freehand. All right? Cuts rough lumber as well as surface lumber. So pretty flexible machine, can do lots of things.